So for the final part of this particular section of the Teach Me, it's me. And the reason why I wanted to do a presentation is because this is something which is really, really important to me. And I've titled it Burning Bras, Ball Breakers and Banshees, Oh, and Victims. And it's looking at gender within history and how it is that perhaps we can change how we're teaching gender in history. You're quite happy to know I'm not going to go and burn my bra later on. Maybe after a few Prosecco's I might, but you know. So this is who I am. So I'm a Lamb Heart Tea, and I am someone who's incredibly interested in feminist history. This was me when I worked at the wonderful Beamish Museum, doing a protest in Newcastle city centre, recreating a march in 1910, and that was the suffragette bike ride. So what I'd like for you to do is discuss with the person next to you, what do you think these lovely women are doing in medieval England? So what do you think these ladies are doing in medieval England? 10 seconds, have that conversation. Right, okay, so ending conversations. I have to be really careful because I did a training session the other day and I shushed the teachers. I went shh, and it was really embarrassing, so I'm really sorry if I shush you. So can I have some ideas? What do we think these lovely women are doing in medieval England?
Building a wall.
Damn it, you're that kid. You're that kid. You are that kid. Oh, yeah, there's always that kid in the room. So yes, they are in fact building a wall, okay? Here's another question to try and bring it back. Who expected to see that? Who expected to see women in medieval England building a wall?
You got one here, Alex.
Two people, excellent, okay? So what we can see is that's something that perhaps we wouldn't have expected of women in medieval England, and that's not something that we incorporate in our curriculum, and perhaps it is that the things that we are choosing to incorporate in our curriculum or the exam specifications are asking us to teach is actually giving a false perception of what women actually did in the past. So I did a little shout out on Twitter, and we can see here that this was some information about what it is that we teach in history. So we can see that we've got medieval women, damsel in distress. We've also got second wave feminism as part of a bigger topic, but what's interesting is I think I'm the only one in the department doing that. Okay, why? It's amazing that person is, but why is that the only person in the department doing it? We've got here, we touch on Florence Nightingale and nursing in medicine at GCSE. So I teach history of medicine at GCSE, and women are not really focused upon in that. We've got women in the home, we've got Florence Nightingale, we might kind of touch upon a couple of others, but there's not really anyone in there. Why not? These women had an impact in medicine. If we're looking at significance in medicine, we should be looking at them. And that's about it. Interestingly as well is it's this idea that perhaps we all want to think about how it is that we're teaching history and gender. We were sad it disappeared from GCSE. I used to do a fantastic module, and it was on British Society and Change, 1900 to 1928, and we looked at World War I, and we looked at the suffragettes and all that sort of thing. But now that kind of dialogue has died off from the curriculum that we've got. And then what we've got is this person. I really, really like this idea, the idea that teaching history, War of the Roses. I have to admit, I don't include any women when I teach War of the Roses, yet this person is like, it's a man-heavy topic on the face of it, but actually when we look down underneath it, there is a much richer narrative that we can give when we are teaching students. So in history, we kind of do a kind of approach where it is that we teach about all these different things and, oh, a lesson on women. And then we teach about these different things and, oh, there's a lesson on women. But instead, should it be that if we're looking at kind of like technology, is it not both genders which should be incorporated in that? And I have to admit, when I learned how to teach, it's hard to believe they let me pass, I know. But when I learned to teach the national curriculum, it was almost like a tick list. Yes, I've done diverse history. Yes, I've done women. Yes, I've done the Holocaust. And is it perhaps a little bit of a hangover from that? And does that distort a student's perception of what makes events, actions, or significant? So we might say women weren't significant in the 18th, 19th century because they weren't involved in any political movements. And I've had a student kind of say that to me, and I was like, oh, I am not teaching history right here. Ooh, that's not great. Because actually, when we look at it, women who ran French Enlightenment salons, now I'd taught the French Revolution, but I hadn't taught the role of women and how they contributed to kind of this wider dialogue. Signing, presenting petitions, the large campaigns in anti-slavery. We probably all do William Wilberforce, but do we always incorporate the other women who were involved in that as well? And then we've got things like the Everyday Women campaign. So when we're looking at industrial revolution and we're looking at kind of coal mines, are we also making sure that we are looking at the role of women within that? And also as well, the Chartist movement, because they were involved in supporting that. So for me, I think that it's that we perhaps only commonly learn about male-centric politics in the 1700s, and it seems to be that all of a sudden, in the 1900s, the suffragettes just emerged from nowhere, that women had no political power, they had no agency, apart from maybe Elizabeth I, and then all of a sudden, ta-da, suffragettes, like wild banshees kind of screaming in the streets. And then you've got to think, well, what impact is that having upon their perception of women in the past? And also as well, if we're only looking at kind of like the suffragettes and stuff like that, are we looking at other ways that women were significant? So things like, if we look at social impacts, and Maud Pember-Reeves was a massive force in terms of social surveys and that sort of thing. So perhaps it is that we need to look beyond political poster girls and instead look at a wider diverse diet. Because might that lead us to an unconscious bias? So the idea that there might be a false perception that perhaps to be recognised, you've got to be a bra-burning radical, a banshee or a ball breaker. Otherwise, in history, you're not going to be looked at if you're a woman. And for me, I think that's got quite a lot of dangers to it. So I think as part of that, perhaps we need to look at history as an empowerment tool for girls. So the idea that they know that there's not a preset criteria that means this is how you get recognised in history, because my fear is that if we're saying we study this woman because she did this amazing radical thing, that then girls will think, well, I'm never going to be able to do that. I'm never going to be able to kind of create a campaign like that. But they've got agency in other ways. And I think if we study a wider kind of impact that women had in different remits, then it'll open those doors to them as well. And also as well for boys, it's that fear of kind of reinforcing a stereotype of women. Because I went in my NQT year and I was like, oh, an all-boys school, I'm going to introduce the suffragettes because there's no women in the curriculum. And then I realised that I just taught them like loads of women came in 1900, like kind of screaming that they wanted change, getting arrested, going on hunger strike. And that had kind of reinforced their kind of stereotypes that women were kind of like these screaming, kind of like irrational, emotional kind of like women, the very thing that I was trying not to get them to learn. And if I'd looked about it in a much more kind of wider way, I could have taught that a lot better. So I did a little Twitter audit again, and these are the most common topics which are studied in our schools from everyone that tweeted. And as you can see, that there is a big focus on medicine, Germany, Mary I, Elizabeth, and suffrage as well. But when we're looking at it, are we sure that Elizabeth is teaching everything that we want it to teach? So does it cover what we want to cover? Are there opportunities to rethinking our approach? So we're looking at how women ran the households. They were the economic managers of the home and the agency that that gave them, tending to injuries and providing medicinal advice. Catherine Fenkel, who was actually a businesswoman at that time, and the impact that that had upon apprenticeships. When we look at suffrage, perhaps instead of looking at pop-up suffragettes, we instead look at the longer narrative of it. So actually when we have a look at it in the Anglo-Saxons time, women actually had quite a lot of power through kind of religion and that sort of thing. And then the Normans arrived and that kind of agency diminished. So how about it is that we look at it over a longer period of time and look at how women's agency was at one point and then it diminished, it regressed, and then at different points how they sought to influence different areas at different times. So if we have a look at that, for example, you could have a look at how women, Norman to modern, how their agency has changed, and then also look at the conflict between them, because second wave feminists and first wave feminists, they've got a lot of kind of criticism. Second wave feminists actually really do criticize first wave feminists, and that leads to an interesting dialogue as well. So this is some information that I found from an article by the Historical Association, and it's some views that some students kind of gave about some of their kind of like history lessons. So I'm not saying Jane Austen isn't great, but if you like a woman who doesn't done something as much as the men, then the men have done, then it makes the situation worse. So actually when we look at it, yes, she wrote a book, but what about those other people who aren't going to write a book? Does that mean that they then don't get kind of noted down in history? So that diverse diet will help with that. And we've got this here. If you're teaching about it just because they're women, you're enforcing the separation from male history, which isn't what you actually want them to do. So the idea is that you want to give that more kind of blended approach. And Ruth Tudor actually came up with this idea that the dilemma Tudor recognised is that mainstreaming women's history, there is a danger that of women's uniqueness. So whilst we're creating this kind of blended approach, we must make sure as well that we don't lose that kind of like certain narrative within it. So for me, I'd like to look at the power of sources from women. Okay, so women can provide a whole range of different types of sources. So this is Maud Pember-Ree's book, and from this one source written by this one woman, you can look at caregivers in the home, you can look at economic managers, you can look at their role in social reform and creating the first ever Sure Start Centre. So have a look at some other sources from women in a period which is male-centric, really dig into what the women were doing at that time. When we look at these different types of sources, we can see we might not expect that actually women were involved in making the manuscripts all the way back in the older ages, and yet actually they are involved in making those manuscripts. So why do we only study the ones which males created? There are different things where we can look at women in terms of newspapers. It's really hard to find a working class woman's voice in World War I, but actually if you have a look at the newspapers where they were writing in about the plight that their sons and their husbands were facing, there's some really interesting things. And when you look at their cross stitch and their knitting patterns and all those different things, we can find all of these interesting narratives hidden within these most unexpected sources. You can see here, this is an example of one of the sources where there's a woman who's written in about a letter that she's received from her son on the front line, and it gives us that insight. So there are many different sources. So you can see here that women were involved in different associations. We can have a look at their ration books and how it is that they managed during that time. And again, you can see there's this rich diet. This is a woman who has written to a guy on the front line, and that's because her son has died and she wants his belongings back. And she knew that this guy fought alongside him. And these are the letters that she's writing about. Can you please just check in his pockets? Can you please just check in the trench where he was? Because I really, really want this item belonged. And there's such an endearing relationship that goes between that. So studying those different sources. Okay, so we've got here as well different sources from women. Right, I've done what I've promised I wouldn't do, which is run over. So I'm just going to quickly move on to this slide. So, okay, so my final thing is women up. So what I want to do is reinforcing that it's not male only, with opportunities for further independent study. So we've all heard of Meanwhile Elsewhere. Why aren't we doing that with women as well? So kind of like female equivalent of Meanwhile Elsewhere. Let's have a look at a blended, not binary approach. So the idea of when we're looking at technology in World War I, why don't we have kind of like medicine and we're looking at men and women role in it? So here's a lesson on kind of RAMC and here's a lesson on the FANY. Include a range of women's history contributions, so things such that take them beyond bra burner, ball breaker, banshee or victim. Use a range of sources and also think about, yes, there is an exam constraint, but I've got a cheeky little thing for you, because when I teach history of medicine, I'm going to teach far more about what women did in the history of medicine, because you know why? Other relevant material may also be credited. It's not on the spec, but any other relevant material must be credited. Now, that doesn't mean that you go crackers and you teach them like absolutely everything that isn't on the spec, but just think it wouldn't be wrong for them to write about those different things, as far as I'm concerned. So next steps, just if you'd really like to get involved, come let me know. So I'm really sorry I've run over. Thank you.
Just very quickly for me, an amazing, I'm sure you agree, amazing standard of presentation so far today. It's been absolutely insane. Just to introduce now another one of our sponsors who's just going to talk to you for 5 minutes about what they do. I would say Brett over here works for People Progress, sponsors the geography event and the history event. As I said earlier today, without the support of our sponsors,